I'm Jeff Gracer. I'm chair of the Environmental Law Committee. And on behalf of the Environmental Law Committee, the International Environmental Law Committee, and the Energy Committee of the City Bar, we're pleased to sponsor this panel on energy and environmental issues in the presidential election. Our co-sponsors are the Environmental Law Institute, whose president, John CRUDEN, will be moderating this panel. And another co-sponsor is the Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia, headed by Mike GERRARD to my left. I just wanted to mention one quick upcoming conference. October 22nd, there's going to be a conference that we're co-sponsoring at Columbia on the future of RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There are flyers in the back if anyone's interested. And with that, I will turn it over to John to introduce the panel.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Jeff was actually the inspiration of this entire event, so I want to pay tribute to you for thinking of it, and we were very pleased to be invited to come here. But I want to start just for a second of a larger memory piece. I'm at Washington, D.C. I live in Virginia. This morning, coming here, I drove by our memorial to the 9/11 victims and the Pentagon, and I cannot help but remember those tragic events and the great heroism that we saw. And I just want to take just a second for all of us to remember, think about loved ones, think about the heroism, and at the same time pay tribute to our men and women in armed forces who are putting themselves in dangerous situations every day. So if you would just think about it for a little bit, those extraordinary individuals. So this year at the Environmental Law Institute, we give an annual award that we have been doing for some time. It draws over 700 people. We'll do it on November the 8th, a few days after the election, relevant to our discussion here today. This year, for the first time, we actually picked a city that we wanted to honor, and the mayor of that city on November the 8th will come to D.C. And pick it. We picked New York City. And Mayor Bloomberg has agreed that he will be present. So I just want to tell you that Eli has a connection to you all as well, and an important connection. There are a number of people in the audience who are extraordinarily parts of the Environmental Law Institute. This is being put together by something we now call the Leadership Council. The president of the Leadership Council is Ken Berlin, who will speak to you. The vice president, Kathy Robb, would have been here, but she broke bones and is now at home recovering from that. But Jeff is on the Leadership Council, and I also, somewhere, is my predecessor, one of the best lawyers I know, Leslie Crothers. Leslie, would you raise your hand, please? Leslie is a visiting scholar at Pace, but she came out of an enormous environmental background, and I treasure our friendship. But now let's do it. Let's turn to the campaigns, and I'm going to introduce our speakers. Let me say at the outset that we have really drawn from extraordinary individuals, and you'll hear from them. They all come from different walks of life. They all have different roles in other campaigns. But I want to emphasize today that each and every one of them are speaking in their individual capacity. They are not speaking for a particular campaign. They're not doing that. You'll hear different views. They'll be fully capable of giving diverse opinions. But again, I want to make it clear, they're not speaking for either of the campaigns. But all right, the conventions are over. Clint Eastwood has retired his empty chair. Bill Clinton has been enshrined. We're moving from a marathon to a sprint. The battleground states like Virginia, where I am, and Ohio, are being besieged with advertisements every single day. The robocalls are flowing in. And we are getting closer and closer to debates. And hopefully, the debates will crystallize substantive issues. You have before you the 12 questions that the Environmental Law Institute sent to Jim Lehr, who's going to moderate the first panel the first week in October, as suggestions of questions that he might ask the presidential candidates. Tomorrow we will send that same list to both campaigns and tell them, since ELI is an independent, non-government organization that is completely bipartisan, then we're not trying to catch anybody by surprise. What we're trying to do is make sure that there's a dialogue on these issues that we think are extraordinarily important, and that's what we hope to do today, and here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to introduce our four panelists in the order that they will speak. Each of them will speak anywhere from 8 to 12 minutes without questions. At the end of the time, I will have a few questions for them, but they're really questions designed to let them talk to one another. And that should actually take almost the first half of the presentation. The second half is yours. And I will open it up to questions. I really want questions as opposed to dissertations. And because this is being taped, and we do have reporters in the audience, we'll need, and you'll have to remind me to repeat the question so that it's caught on to the tape. The tape will then be put on the Environmental Law Institute a website so that other people who can't come today will be able to hear not only our views, but their questions that you in the audience would ask. All right, who do we have with us? My first speaker will be Mark McINTOSH. Mark is a strategic political policy and public relations advisor, but most recently he was the policy director for Governor John Huntsman's presidential campaign, where he was the senior advisor and principal architect of Governor Huntsman's campaign policies, policy strategy, and political communication. Before then, he was in the firm of Boyd and Gray. Before then, he was a deputy general counsel at the White House, working both for the White House Counsel and the Council on Environmental Quality. Following Mark will be Ken Berlin. Ken Berlin is the general counsel of the Coalition for Green Capital, a group of attorneys representing clients in all aspects of climate change work. He was, till fairly recently, the head of the law firm practice for environment and climate change at Skadden Arps. He is a longtime author of numerous works and a former chair of the board of Environmental Law Institute. Following, Ken will be Ray LUDWIZZEWSKI. He is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher. He joined Gibson after a number of years in senior positions in both the Department of Justice and Environmental Protection Agency. Before then, he was actually a clerk for Judge Henry Friendly of the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. And then finally, we saving best for last, is Mike GERRARD, who's the Sabin Professor of Professional Practice at Columbia Law School, where he teaches courses on environmental law, climate change, and energy law, and he's been the director of the center since 2009. Before then, he was practicing in Arnold and Porter, ultimately becoming a managing partner. In his past, he's been the head of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. He's written a number of books, 9 or 10 books, all of them in the environmental arena. That's our group, and let's start out with you, Mark.
Thanks so much. I'm a policy guy, not so much a communications guy, so I don't do this all that often. Most communications people want to keep policy guys away from the mic because we can't talk in short sentences. My perspective, I guess what I can bring to this conversation is kind of the nuts and bolts of a campaign, especially the primary, and what all of you, or maybe some of you, witnessed. I don't know if everybody paid attention. Because my responsibility was not just to one singular policy issue, but rather all of them, energy and environment was a small piece of that. One, because of kind of the nature of the issues at hand for this particular campaign, and a certain level of toxicity as it relates to especially climate change that everybody witnessed during the primary process. What I found most fascinating as we constructed policy, and Governor Huntsman asked me when I came on to try to push the envelope on policy for the primary, try to influence the rest of the candidates to really dive down, dig deep into the policy areas, whether it's tax reform or energy policy, and get into specifics. And I think that's something that all of you are probably witnessing now, which is a big question about specificity that you're not hearing from either candidate that's running right now on most policy, especially energy and environment. So as it relates to climate change and energy environment as an issue, what I found most fascinating was, unlike past campaigns over the last 20 years where Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security were the third rails that we'd never wanted to touch simply because it provided too much fodder for our competitors, whether it's on our side of the aisle or on the Democratic side of the aisle. However, this cycle, the #1 most toxic issue was climate change, in my opinion. I think that was a result of the politics of the climate bill back in 2010. There was a great deal of bitterness as it relates to kind of how that transpired, and also what happened up on the Hill on healthcare. So we set about trying to deal with the issue, but at the same time not get into trying to address it, but not address it head on, just purely from a political perspective. If any of you read any of the policies that we drafted, energy was fairly thorough. The governor had some strong beliefs as it relates to the need for energy policy for the country. And we didn't get to do everything that we wanted to during the primary just because of bandwidth problems with a small campaign. But his philosophy was that there needed to be it's purely economic, as he even looks at immigration as an economic policy. In order for the country to grow again economically, there needs to be, and you've heard this for the last 30, 40 years, the desire to develop a broad energy policy for the country. But nobody's put anything on the table that is compelling to the American public, I don't think. And one of the things that Governor Huntsman strongly believed in was to take energy and turn it into a geopolitical foreign policy. And I'm not trying to suggest new policy here at the table, but the thought was that there was a desire to get both parties, and our party specifically, to think about energy in a broad geopolitical sense. And what I mean by that is we were intending to propose the equivalent of America's OPEC, something that we could create with our friends both up in the north and down south. There's a lot of details I'm not going to get to here, but I think that was a starting point for us in order to get the country to engage in energy as a broad policy of economic importance and strategic international importance. So that was something that was driving us. Some of the things that happened during the campaign that I wasn't particularly happy about was, and I've talked to many people about this. People respect Governor Huntsman for his candor. Some of the things that were put out, especially there was a very famous tweet that I'm not sure anybody knows about, but it's out there, as much as I'd rather it not be. But he said that it was playing off of, I think, Herman Cain. I can't quite remember. There were certainly plenty of individuals to play off of during our primary. But it was, I'm paraphrasing, call me crazy, but I believe in science. I think that was the governor's tweet, which my head blew off when it went out and I wasn't told. Because that basically put us in a box that I didn't want us to be in as compared to all the other candidates. We then went on to at least get to the point where the governor does believe that while there's still questions as it relates to science, the thought of human impact exists and needs to be debated. I believe were eviscerated for that. But fascinating enough, I now see that Governor Romney has actually said the same thing as of late, which is not surprising. We were playing, I think, the general election, which we shouldn't have been, and we were not playing the primary game. We did talk about Keystone. Keystone was something that we firmly believed needed to be implemented. I don't believe that, from a policy perspective, it's not something. Keystone's going to happen, whether anybody likes it or not. I don't believe that the White House is being particularly sincere as it relates to their position. From a political perspective, it actually probably would have been more strategic for him just to come out and say that recently, but he didn't. Renewables was also a kind of a place where we did discuss from a policy perspective the importance of it. I think you hear the all of the above mantra from both parties. But what I've taken away from my experience, at least with this particular policy issue during this campaign, is that both sides are unwilling to really dig down and go deep on the policies and think strategically about how you implement something that the American people will agree with, that you can get a broader acceptance, not just to one segment of the population. And we only have two of them, it seems. They're basically split down the middle. And neither party has done that very well during this cycle. And I think I'll just leave it at that.
Mark, thank you very much. We turn it over to Ken Berlin.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much. I'm here not representing the Obama campaign, but I am going to talk about the accomplishments of the Obama administration and some of the underlying factors that really form the basis for the way they look at the world of energy and the environment. Now, if Governor Huntsman were running for president, I think a lot of things I'm saying now, I'm saying a very different way than I'm saying running against Mitt Romney right now. So I do want to make that very clear, and I commend Mark for the work he did during the campaign. There are three areas of accomplishment that I'd like to talk about. One is transitioning to a clean energy economy. The second is reducing our dependence on imported oil. And the third is talking about management and conservation of our public lands and our natural resources. But before I get to those, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about what I think are the underlying drivers of the policy that the administration has followed for the last 4 years, and there is a deep record of what they've done for 4 years. And I think when you look at that, and if you look at it carefully, you'll see fundamental differences between what President Obama is proposing, what Mitt Romney is proposing, what the Democratic Party is proposing now, and what the vast majority of the Republican Party is proposing now. And let me start with those. The first is, I think we look at, and again, I'm speaking for myself, there's no written record of this, but I think we look at transitioning to a clean energy economy as critical to America's economic future. Not just doing it for environmental reasons, but also doing it for economic reasons. Clean energy is going to be one of the great industries of the 21st century. It's going to be one of the great sources of innovation in the world economy for the next 50 years or whatever time period. There's no doubt that you're talking about industries that will do trillions of dollars of business in the years ahead. And if you think about it, going back to the automobile, the United States has been the leader of every great technological revolution and innovation really since the start of the 20th century. We run the risk of not being the leader in this clean energy revolution if we don't implement policies that get clean energy off the ground, that give a very, very high priority to developing clean energy and renewables. We will not develop those industries, and we will suffer from that for decades going forward if we don't do that economically. Second, in addressing clean energy and oil imports, we do believe in an all-in strategy, and I think, and I disagree with Mark, I think we have articulated a very strong all-in strategy, and we don't get an all-in strategy on the other side. On oil imports, for example, we strongly support, and the President has put in place tremendously increased mileage standards that double the amount of mileage we'll get out of automobile fleets, that regulate the amount of mileage from heavy-duty trucks for the first time. He's strongly supporting electric hybrids, electric cars, natural gas vehicles. We're looking at all of the reduced supply side of this equation, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But he's also supported more oil production. We are producing more oil now, as I'll say in a minute, than we have for, I think we're at the highest level in 14 years in the United States right now. We are opening areas to oil. I'll talk about that in more detail. So there is an all-in policy. Now, it's true we don't say we do oil development at the expense of everything else in the environment. We think we can have a balanced approach to doing this that leads to more oil development while still protecting natural resources. We believe in dealing with carbon capture and sequestration. We believe in looking at nuclear. We believe in looking at all the options out there that are necessary to bring about this transition and to figure out how you put all this together in an energy policy over a long period of time. Third, we think there's a false choice if people say you've got to make a choice between protecting the environment and economic growth. We don't think there's empirical evidence that supports that. And if you take the most recent example of that, which was Mitt Romney's statement in the Republican convention that, I don't have the exact words, that I'm not going to deal with rising oceans, I'm going to deal with protecting people. We don't think you can separate those two things out. We think there's a false choice when you say that. We think protecting the environment leads to sustainable growth. When you look at rising oceans, the impact of that is not just environmental. It will have a profound impact, for example, on the people of Florida as individuals. That will have a profound impact on the economy of Florida. We're seeing that now. We think we have to deal with that right now. Fourth, on our public lands, we think properly managing our public lands and managing them for multiple use is really critical. Mitt Romney said at one point he doesn't know the purpose of public lands. We do know the purpose of public lands. The public lands are a heritage that's been handed down to this country through many generations. We have a responsibility to hand it on to future generations well. We think you can manage public lands in a way that enables them to be used for energy development on the one hand. We can be used for preservation of lands. It can be used for recreational purposes. We support the concept of figuring out how to use lands, how to develop our natural resources in a way that both leads to energy development and leads to protection. That may mean there are some areas we can't open to oil development, but there are many areas we can open, and we think we can move towards energy self-sufficiency even with that in place. We also fall short between saying you have to make a choice between pollution and economic growth. The administration, for example, has promulgated regulations on mercury and toxic chemical emissions from power plants. Those regulations, scientists say will prevent 11,000 premature deaths a year, 130,000 cases of asthma a year. The public benefits of those, we think, far outweigh the costs of those regulations. I think if you look at the studies out there of the impact on regulation, on job loss, The National Bureau of Labor Statistics just came out with a brand new study. You'll see that, in fact, the job losses are extremely low from this, arguably counterbalanced by the benefits of environmental protection. So we think that's a false choice. We do think you have to address climate change. President Obama said that in his acceptance speech. We think the scientific evidence on that is unequivocal. I think that climate change is happening now. The recent studies, like the study by James Hansen, begin to show that if you look at historical data, the chances of this being a cycle are becoming vanishingly small. The evidence is overwhelming that we're beginning to see events that are a result of climate change right now. We think it's an issue that needs to be addressed now, both for our current generation and for future generations. And I do emphasize our current generation also. So with that background, let me just talk a little bit about the administration's accomplishments. The first question is, what has the administration done to transition to a clean energy economy? What has it done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? It's obviously started off in its first 2 years trying to pass cap and trade legislation. That legislation passed in the House of Representatives. It did not pass in the Senate. So the question becomes, how can you deal with this without putting a price on carbon, without putting a price on carbon pollution? And in fact, if you look at the elements of transitioning to a clean energy economy, you'll see that the administration has a very strong record with regard to every single one of those elements. Let's start with support for renewable energy. The stimulus package included $80 billion in support for clean energy and energy efficiency projects. The president supports the production tax credit for wind, which Mitt Romney now says he opposed. The president supports the various tax incentives and other incentives that are out there that help bring renewable industries down their cost curve as the industries develop. I can talk more about that if people want later on, why these provisions are so important. The Waxman-Markey bill included $7.5 billion to develop a national green bank that provide low-cost financing for clean energy and energy efficiency projects. That's something that I've worked on very, very extensively. It's what I really work on full-time when I'm not doing this. The president supports a clean energy standard. He set a goal of generating 80% of our electricity from clean energy sources, diverse clean energy sources by 2035. So the administration has a very strong record on this transition. And if you look in the last 4 years, 35% of all new electric generating capacity in the United States, for example, has been from wind. That stops dead in its tracks if we take the production tax credit for wind away now. But that's where we've been with the kind of support that the administration has been giving to that. The administration is also, as part of a transition to a clean energy economy, has issued very strong regulations relating to pollution. It issued the mercury regulations I just described. It issued the cross-state air pollution rule on NOx and SOx that was just overturned by a court. I don't think you'll see the end of that. And it's issued other regulations relating to that designed to make sure that we generate clean energy to the maximum extent possible. The administration, as I said, has supported on the transportation side. It's put into effect very strong mileage standards for automobiles, trucks. It's provided the kind of support I mentioned, so it's dealing with reducing the use of oil in the United States. It's given very strong support to another key component of this energy efficiency. The stimulus package included about $13.6 billion for energy efficiency measures. Many other programs of the administration have supported an energy efficient economy, standards for federal buildings, things like that. And the administration continue to back that. It's included over $3 billion for smart grid work. I think over 3, maybe it's 4, for smart grid conversion, which is again a critical component of developing a clean energy future. On the side of clean coal, and if you look at fossil fuels on the clean coal side, the administration has given billions of dollars, I think over $3 billion to research on carbon capture and sequestration. But even more importantly, the Waxman-Markey bill included, and I worked on this directly, tens of billions of dollars for carbon capture and sequestration and other technology designed to clean coal. That wasn't passed. It was supported by Democrats. It was supported by Republicans. People like myself were hoping that these measures would bring the coal industry into an industry that's a very modern, strong industry in the 21st century, and that legislation did not pass. I could go on. The administration is supporting the Southern Company's nuclear plants. I can talk more about nuclear if people want, but in general, it's given very, very strong support. On the energy independence side, again, I think the administration has a very strong record. Imports of oil have dropped from about 11 million barrels per day at the start of the administration to about 8 million barrels per day. They've dropped from 60% of all of our oil use to 43% of all of our oil use. The mileage standards that the President developed will help bring us to the next step on this. They will reduce use by about, the estimate is 2.2 million barrels of oil a day. So we're at 5 million. I'm sorry, we're at 8 million now. That'll bring us down another 2.2. The President has set a goal, and that's by 2025. The President has set a goal by 2020 of reducing our oil imports to half of what they were in 2008, or about 5.5 million barrels. We think we're well on the way to that. Domestic production of oil, as I said, is at a 14-year high and likely to increase fairly rapidly because of tight oil and things like that. The production on public lands is actually up. It's higher than it was in the last 3 years of the Bush administration, and 3 of the 5 largest oil and gas leases in history were given out by the Bureau of Land Management in 2011. The administration is looking at this on all sides. It's not a drill, baby, drill at the expense of everything else approach, but it is a balanced approach that reduces our use. It does allow more production, and you'll see the curves start coming together. Less use, more production, and therefore less imports. And in the end, you can't deal with the fundamental energy independence issue, which is our vulnerability to price increases because of events around the world, unless you reduce our dependence on oil. You can't do it by production because oil is an international commodity. If we were producing oil at $50 a barrel and oil is being sold at $100 a barrel in Europe, that oil would be sucked out of the country because it's an international market in oil. So we're working on that. I left out, by the way, on the natural gas side, the President is supporting fracking of natural gas. Again, he wants to see it done in an environmentally responsible way, with regulations dealing with disclosure of chemicals used in fracking, with impacts on water, with air emissions. We think that can be done. We think it is being done. Right now, there's an abundant supply of natural gas. We think that will continue. We think there are economic benefits from that. We think it is part of a strategy to convert to a clean energy economy. So we think there's a role for strong role for natural gas. We think there's a strong role for coal. That's why we've supported clean coal technologies, but we think it has to be a role for clean coal. I think it has to be a role for clean coal. And finally, I'll just say one word on public lands, and then I'll stop. Again, we think the President has a very strong record on that. He's invested in conservation projects in all 50 states. The administration developed a new blueprint for management of national forests and grasslands. We've seen the largest expansion of wilderness in a generation, with over 2 million acres added to the wilderness system. The legislation protected conservation of 1,000 miles of river and 26 million acres of historically significant landscapes. The President has programs designed to protect our treasured landscapes: Chesapeake Bay, Everglades, Great Lakes, Gulf restoration. There are many programs relating to water resources. So again, we're looking for a balanced approach that manages public lands for people, for economic development, and does it in a way that's sustainable and has long-term benefits. With that, I'll stop. Just to summarize again, I think the administration has a very strong record. It's a balanced record. It's a clear record. And I think it's a record that you will see, if the President is reelected, you'll see all of these things deepen. I think we're at an inflection point on clean energy. We can go forward very rapidly now to convert to a clean energy economy. We can stop dead in our tracks. And this election is very critical to which of those paths we take. Thank you.
Ken, thank you very much. Ray LUDWIZZEWSKI.
Thanks, John. It's always great to hear a paid political announcement. I'm here today because we were to discuss what's happening on the energy and environment front and how those issues are going to play out in the presidential campaign that we're now involved in. On that issue, I have good news and bad news. The good news for everybody in the hall who is environmental and energy specialist, is we confront, as a society, some of the most important and fascinating issues that I've seen in over 25 years of working in this field, both in government and in private practice. And I project that over the next 4 or 5 years, we're going to have a lot of activity in the courts and in Congress and at EPA and in the states as we try to address those issues. And just a few of them that we're going to have to decide as a society is, as Ken pointed out, how we're going to access and utilize this sudden abundance of domestic natural gas that technology has brought to us, and the opportunities that that presents to us as a society for energy independence, so we're no longer sending our wealth overseas, often to regimes that don't like us, and the domestic jobs that that will create, because it's impossible to outsource a job in a natural gas field in the United States, and the fact that natural gas can become a practical bridge fuel from our current dependence on dirtier fossil fuels till we can get to the cleaner fuels that technology will hopefully bring us into the future. And we also need to decide how we're going to modernize our environmental laws. The last major environmental law that was comprehensively reauthorized was the Clean Air Act, and that was in 1990. I submit that there are probably people in this room who have never had an environmental law reauthorized in their lifetimes. And for people like Ken and I and John, who've been in this field and still view it as such a young field, that's a fascinating and disappointing, tragic statement. If you take a walk through the other environmental statutes, you see the Clean Water Act last reauthorized in 1987. The HISWA amendments to the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, in 1984. The SARA, the Superfund Amendments to Reauthorization Act for CERCLA, or Superfund, in 1986. So we have a panoply of laws that are solving the problems of the 80s as we are going into the second decade of the 21st century. So we need to decide as a society how we're going to address that. And of course, we also have the longstanding and divisive problem, as Ken pointed out, of greenhouse gases and global warming, and what, if anything, we're going to do about that. And then there's the practical and other issues, like whether or not we're going to build the Keystone Pipeline partially in the United States or entirely in Canada. And those are all issues that we need to march through, and they're going to create some fascinating opportunities to work in the energy and environment field going forward. Now for the bad news. It's my view that none of these issues, and the many other important issues in the energy and environment area, are going to be particularly seriously or meaningfully debated in this presidential election cycle. You can ask, well, how can that be since they're so important? And I would offer a couple of reasons. The first is, I think that they're going to be overshadowed by the economy. When I was at EPA serving as the general counsel, I had the great privilege to work for Bill Riley, who was my EPA administrator. And although Bill and I were both Republicans, I think it's safe to say that we came from different ends of the spectrum that our party supports. And because we had such very different political philosophies, I learned a great deal from Bill Riley. And one thing that Riley, who was a lifelong environmentalist, who had run World Wildlife Federation before coming to EPA for many years, and had actually started out his career at CEQ, and I can't remember whether it was in Nixon or in Ford. But one thing he taught me was that the American voter views environment as a luxury good. The Americans are willing to invest more in environmental protection when they feel more prosperous. And we all know that we are now confronting the longest recession in modern American history. And I think, understandably, American voters are prioritizing pocketbook issues above environmental concerns. It is the reflection of what, of the campaign that we faced in Bush 41, H.W. Bush, where the catchphrase was, it's the economy, stupid. And it is again, the economy and jobs. And so I believe that both campaigns understand that reality, and they are unlikely to see a significant benefit to highlighting environmental policies broadly on the campaign trail. The second reason I think that we're not going to see a a lot of discussion of our issues, is we're about 6 weeks away from the election, and the race is still pretty tight. We don't have any candidate with a commanding lead. The polls suggest that they're within 3 to 5 points of each other, and those same polls seem to indicate that a majority of the voters have already made up their minds. So in the time that's left, what are the two things you do in a campaign? Well, first, you don't alienate your base, and second of all, you try to win over the undecided voters. I believe that that first principle, don't alienate your base, will keep both campaigns from focusing on environmental issues. From the Democratic perspective, and of course I am not a Democratic political strategist, but from the Democratic perspective, I think they will analyze it along the following lines. First, most single-issue environmental voters are going to vote Democratic unless they're strongly provoked to do otherwise. So why invest the scarce time and resources you have left in the remaining 6 weeks to attract a constituency you already have? And second of all, any statement by a Democratic candidate on environmental issues is likely to have the risk of being a twin-edged sword. If it is a strong, aggressive, pro-environmental policy, you run the risk of handing the Republicans an argument that they can make campaign fodder of as being out of touch with the economic and job realities of this economy. On the other hand, if it's a more moderate or balanced environmental position, then you run the risk of alienating your environmental base. So for the Democrats, silence seems like a good strategy. Now you flip over to the Republican calculus. Again, for the Republicans, the key issue, the discussion in this election, needs to be about jobs in the economy if they're going to be successful. Aggressively pro-environmental policies run the risk of alienating their conservative activist base. Extreme anti-environmentalist policies run afoul of your second goal, which of course is to try to attract and win over the undecided voter, as undecided voters often have a reasonably pro-environmental policy bent. So for that reason, I think the Republicans also stay away from this issue. Let me offer you a concrete illustration as to why I think that's true and that supports my point. As you all know, we have been, that is, this country has been for the last several months in an extreme drought. July was the hottest month ever since they've been recording temperatures in the United States. In Traverse City, Michigan, they had the annual cherry festival, and they had to import cherries from Japan because their crop was such a failure. The Big Rapids Pioneer reports that about 90% of the Michigan apple crop is a failure. Now, I'm very familiar, I'm in Manhattan, and I've seen the famous New Yorker covers. So for those of you who may be geographically challenged, Michigan is at the very north of the United States, and indeed Traverse City and Big Rapids, most people would almost think are in Canada. And that's the level that the drought drove those very northern portions of our country. You can imagine what happened in Texas and in the more southern reaches of the country. Yet, despite that, neither campaign is speaking aggressively about global warming. When we did the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, and I was at EPA working with Bill Riley, we were praying for a mild summer because we were terrified of what would happen in Congress at a hot summer to the bill and the direction it would go in, and whether we could still maintain moderate support for it. So for that reason, I think we have evidence that our issues this campaign cycle are likely to not come to the fore, unfortunately, and that we're probably going to have to wait until the campaign is over and we're in the next legislative cycle before we see whether or not there is progress on those very important issues that I highlighted at the beginning of my talk. John?
Ray, thank you very much. Michael Gerrard.
Thanks very much. I thought it would be useful to address what are the one or two questions that I would ask if I had the opportunity to pose a question at the debate. And the first question on my list is, what would be the role of science in your administration? I have to say it's profoundly disheartening to hear that Governor Huntsman was vilified by his party for endorsing science. Science is a central aspect of every environmental law and policy. It's central to air pollution, water pollution, hazardous waste, protection of oceans, of forests, of species. Everything is founded on science. And we've established in this country institutions that have served us well in assessing contested scientific matters that become a basis for public policy. We have the National Academies of Science, we have the professional scientific societies, we have the peer-reviewed scientific literature, and when it becomes embedded in a public policy issue, in a regulatory issue, and there's a belief that there isn't an adequate basis for the decisions made by the agencies, we have judicial review. I think it's important that the administration that's in power respects these processes and will use them in setting policies. So there are clearly a number of things that I'm concerned about when I hear the stance of the Romney-Ryan ticket on issues where science plays a role, especially, obviously, climate change. If there's anything on which there is a general scientific agreement that's more complex than the law of gravity, it's that human activity is having an effect on the climate and that it's mostly negative. There's obviously room for legitimate debate about how quickly it's happening, what exactly are the mechanisms by which it's happening, and what are the best ways to address the problem. But in terms of the overall sense of whether human activities are affecting the climate, every scientific institution that we have resoundingly says yes. That's the case with the National Academy of Science, and so far as I know, every professional scientific society that has looked at the issue, overwhelming sense in the peer-reviewed literature. And the science has been challenged in court several times, and it has always won. There is, to my knowledge, not a single written decision by a U.S. judge, either writing for the majority or the dissent, that casts doubt on climate science. Quite a number of judges found ways to avoid the issue, and a couple have acknowledged that there is debate, but all the decisions that have been that have addressed the issue have said, yes, there is this problem. But the climate skeptics dominate the faction that today controls the Republican Party. It's such a profound difference from 4 years ago. Senator McCain, of course, was the principal sponsor of a major cap-and-trade bill. But at the Republican convention 2 weeks ago, this was alluded to. Let me read you exact language that Governor Romney said in his acceptance speech. President Obama promised to slow the rise of the oceans, pause for extended laughter, and to heal the planet. My promise is to help you and your family. That's a statement that's going to be shown in television documentaries for decades, when people look back at what were they thinking in this era. So there's a lot of room for debate about exactly what is it that we do. We can certainly debate whether it's cap and trade or a carbon tax or a command and control system or a switch to certain energy sources. But you don't get there if you deny the existence of the problem. And if you deny the existence of the problem, you're certainly not going to take the actions that are going to be necessary to cope with the climate change that is already baked into the system. The front page of today's New York Times had a remarkable article about how the city of New York is not prepared for climate change, for sea level rise, for the other things that could destroy our infrastructure and have all kinds of other consequences. But if you say it's not going to happen, you are certainly not going to adapt to it if you think that it is a fiction. Now, the most encouraging thing that I've seen recently is that a few days ago, Scientific American came out with the results of a survey that had been they had asked each of the candidates a number of questions, and let me just read you the beginning of Governor Romney's response. I am not a scientist myself, but my best assessment of the data is that the world is getting warmer, that human activity contributes to that warming, and that policymakers should therefore consider the risk of negative consequences. That was a terrific statement, you know, compared to what we've been hearing. However, there remains a lack of scientific consensus on the issue, on the extent of warming, the extent of the human contribution, and the severity of the risk, and I believe we must support continued debate and investigation within the scientific community. He goes on to say we shouldn't do much of anything about it, except I support robust government funding for research on efficient, low emissions technologies that will maintain American leadership in emerging industries, which is an extremely hard statement to line up against the Ryan budget, which calls for a massive decrease in development and R&D on energy technology. And he calls for a new wave of investment in nuclear power, which may be okay, but the wave of investment in nuclear power involves enormous federal subsidies, which I thought in general was something that weren't to be favored. Aside from the climate issue, the scientific studies show us many examples of the crucial importance of environmental regulations. There are numerous scientific studies that show that any number of tightened air pollution regulations would each save thousands or tens of thousands of lives. But if you don't believe any of that, if you don't believe the underlying science, then environmental regulations are pure cost with no benefit, and therefore obviously you're not going to engage in them. So I want to know what the client what the candidates are going to say about how they're going to use science in their administration. The second major question that I want to ask the candidates is, in your approach to environmental and energy problems, will it be premised on maintaining and increasing existing consumption levels, or are you going to entertain proposals that would reduce consumption? The U.S. has far and away, on a per capita basis, the highest consumption of energy and other resources in the world, rivaled only by Canada and Australia. The Republican platform and the speeches are based exclusively on the supply side, on drilling for oil and digging and gas and mining for coal, and otherwise continuing to consume and consume and consume. Energy efficiency is the single most important thing that we can do to address greenhouse gas emissions and many other environmental problems. There is tremendous potential with energy efficiency and conservation, and many of the actions for energy efficiency save money, and a lot of them save money pretty quickly with a fairly fast payback period. The most important action that's been taken on energy efficiency in recent years is the fuel economy standards that were adopted by the Obama administration after 30 years of paralysis, and Governor Romney opposed those standards. Another thing that has been done that was very important for energy efficiency is that in 2007, the second president signed into law an energy law that created performance standards for light bulb. And today's incandescent light bulbs can't meet that standard, and as a result, nobody is making incandescent light bulbs anymore. The energy that is saved by one enactment is the equivalent of the output of 11 nuclear power plants. And yet, Congressman Ryan supported the bill that would stop that law and that would give everyone the right to be bathed in the light of incandescent light bulbs. So we've heard zero from that side of the aisle on energy efficiency or other consumption related measures. And I think that is a major problem. The final thing that I wanted to mention is the subject of subsidies. Congress is facing the issue of whether to renew the production tax credit for the wind industry, and Governor Romney has come out against extending that. on the notion that the federal government should not be picking winners and losers and should let market forces dominate. But the Environmental Law Institute, the organization that John heads and that is co-sponsoring this program, came out with a report actually when Leslie was president called Estimating U.S. Government Subsidies to Energy Sources 2002 and 2008. And it scrupulously documents, as do many other studies, that the energy subsidies that we've had in this country for decades have overwhelmingly favored fossil fuels and continue to. That we have today a whole raft of subsidies for oil and gas and coal, and also for nuclear, and yet it's renewables that are being targeted as unduly picking winners off the federal fisc. That too greatly concerns me and makes me concerned that in the event that the election goes in that direction, we will see more drilling, more fossil fuels, more consumption, and that is completely unsustainable, and that when the United States finally comes to its senses, we will have a profoundly deeper hole to dig out of. Thank you.
You could probably figure out that not every panelist agrees with each other on that. I have a few questions. And the difference now is we really are going to give the panelists an opportunity to talk to one another, you know. So I'm going to call on Mark first to ask questions, but it'll be the same way. We'll ask a question of a particular individual, but every bill could not pass. Do you see that changing some in the future? Do you see Republicans supporting a climate change bill? And if not, why not?
No. Waxman Markey died long before it even hit the floor. President Obama used most of his capital on healthcare. I mean, that was a predictable, that was predictable. So anybody that thought that the climate bill was going to pass, even a year beforehand, doesn't really understand the political dynamics of Washington. My view, I'm not going to talk for Governor Huntsman or any other candidate, but from a Republican perspective, if I'm drafting policy, because because of the malaise that we are in economically, it is very difficult to push those kinds of policies that potentially put us at an economic disadvantage with the rest of the planet. Climate change is a global phenomenon. It needs a solution that is broad and international in scope. China needs to be brought to the table. We're not going to do anything until China does something. I mean, from a Republican perspective. So there's also just the pure politics of the issue that people don't quite understand. I'll try to make this brief. It was adopted by the environmental community long ago. They became more political. They chose a side. Even though Republicans in the past, which everybody likes to talk about with Nixon and Roosevelt and the like, they chose a side to work with more predominantly than the other. I'm not blaming them only. I think I blame both the environmental community and the Republican Party to a certain degree. By choosing a side, you politicize the issue. So as a Republican politician, if I'm running for Congress, why would I engage in those issues if I don't see any political benefit to them? And that is a direct result of kind of the politicization of the issues, of environmental issues as a whole. It drove away the Republican Party because they took the political calculation. I mean, maybe that's too simple, but that's my belief and what I viewed. So, as it relates to climate change, I certainly don't see. There's certainly not going to be any legislative effort in the next 4 years, regardless of who's in office, because it won't pass. I take issue. Well, I take issue with a bunch of things that Ken said, but one is President Obama did not come up with a clean energy standard. You know that, Ken. That was a Republican idea. As an alternative.
I never said it wasn't.
I'm sorry?
I never said it wasn't.
Well,
I said he supports one.
Ken, you get to go next, so keep going, and then
Look,
you go next.
the CES was a construct from the Republicans, and I worked with them on that as an alternative to Waxman Markey because we knew it wouldn't pass. It's unfortunate, and when I think this is a good example of the politics. I was at Jim Connaughton's house, who was the former chair of CEQ, during President Obama's State of the Union. I guess it was 2011. Or was it 2010? I can't remember. Anyways, he talked at length about CES, and I literally fell off the couch because I said, well, that policy is now dead because just of the political dynamics. It's unfortunate, but both sides of the aisle are playing politics with this issue, and it's having repercussions as it relates to trying to get anything done in Washington.
Okay, Ken, Mark says, doesn't make any difference who's president, no climate change legislation. Remember, we didn't describe what type it was. No climate change legislation next 4 years. Do you agree?
Well, I think that obviously we can't get climate change legislation through without Republicans and Democrats, so I'm not going to argue with Mark's analysis of what he thinks is going to happen on the legislation. But that only is discussion, because the question becomes, if you can't get legislation through, what do you do to address climate change in the absence of the legislation? And that's what I tried to talk about previously. I think there's a whole multi-set series of steps the administration is taking to reduce our, well, really to transition to a clean energy economy, and as a result of that, reduce our emissions of CO2. And it's actually working. I mean, the amount of CO2 emissions in the United States dropped from 6 billion tons a year when President Obama came into office to 5.2 billion tons last year. We actually had a bigger drop in emissions than happened in Europe during this time period. Some of it was fortuitous because of the economy, but there was still that drop that took place. And I think the steps that are taken are likely to have that trajectory continue, and in fact will continue going forward. So if you can't raise the price, for example, of carbon, which is what a cap and trade system does, or a carbon tax does, then you have to figure out how to lower the cost of clean energy to replace that, and you have to figure out how to remove the regulatory market infrastructure barriers to that. That's the kind of thing that I've been working on, and most people have been working on in the absence of cap and trade legislation. I do want to say something about this being partisan. I mean, I think a lot of us don't want this to be a partisan issue. We work very, very hard to make these nonpartisan issues. On this green bank work I'm talking about, for example, we got our first green bank bill through in Connecticut last year, and that passed the Connecticut Senate 36-0, in the Connecticut House 139-8. In the Waxman-Markey bill, the green bank provisions, which we think are a key provision for lowering the cost of clean energy, they passed, it passed there out of committee 50-something to like 9. So we do think you can develop bipartisan consensus, and in fact, all of us are trying on the Democratic side to try and figure out how to get bipartisan consensus wherever you can. And deep down in my bones, as somebody who's been involved in this since the early 70s, I don't really understand why this is a partisan issue. I mean, I think the kind of issues we're talking about here now should not be partisan issues to begin with. We're willing to compromise on ways to do this in the most efficient way possible for the business community. Again, I spend a lot of time trying to figure that out. So we're hoping that as time goes on, it won't be. And while I 100% agree with what everybody's saying about the economy is not going to stay bad forever. Whoever wins this election, somewhere down the line, we don't know whether it'll be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, we'll start seeing a robust recovered economy. And then we'll have potentially a different political dynamic.
Ray, same question. We're going to have climate change legislation. Can there be? Is that in the future?
No, there will be no climate change legislation barring something very peculiar happening for at least the next 2 and probably for the next 4 years. There's just no consensus for it in the U.S. Congress. And I know that that's not welcome news to the environmental community, but rather than, which they seem to prefer to do, talk increasingly stridently about the need for the legislation, they need to persuade the American people and their representatives that that's the right answer. And they don't seem to want to admit this, but they've just failed to do that now for nearly 20 years. And I don't think just raising their voice is the right answer. They just need to get more persuasive about it. And they may or may not succeed in doing that at some point in the future, but I don't see the trend reversing itself in the next 2 to 4 years.
Mike, do you agree? There was, in the last election, there was on YouTube a Democrat running for senator was filmed shooting the cap and trade bill. I don't think he meant that in a helpful way. But so, you see a future?
Then Governor, now Senator Manchin, absolutely got a lot of votes, and he's a Democratic politician. Oh, I don't disagree with that at all. I'd like to say one thing actually about China in response to what Mark said, and then ask a question of my colleagues on the panel, if I may. On China, there's no question that that's the elephant in the room, that the growth of emissions in China are really dominating the world's environmental situation, from climate and many other things. And unless it's controlled, we're not going to do anything. The U.S. has absolutely no standing to complain about China's emissions growth. Our per capita emissions are much higher than theirs, and the major reason we're in this mess is that the U.S. and other major developed countries have dumped so much greenhouse gas into the atmosphere that there's almost no room left. But I don't think under any sense of fairness we can tell China to stop growing. I think that we can expect them to greatly reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of their economy and to improve their energy efficiency, and I think they're doing a lot in that direction. But I think the single most important thing we can do with respect to emissions in China is to stop setting such a bad example. The single biggest thing you hear from China, as well as India and other rapidly developing countries about their emissions, is look at the U.S. Look at how profligate they are. Until we stop setting such a terrible example, I don't think we can expect the rest of the world to do anything right. Now, on there is one area where I have a bone to pick with the Obama administration, which is that we are continually complaining about the failure of China to do enough to control climate change, and yet when China devotes enormous resources to improving renewables, we try to seek trade sanctions against them. I think there's a real inconsistency there. I think that we need to encourage growth of renewables and development of renewables and efficiency technology all out wherever it occurs. Instances of overt discriminatory practices should be stopped. But overall, I think that this trade war that we're seeing between the U.S. and China is negative for everybody. Now, I said I wanted to ask a question, and I'd like to ask all three of you, do you think we could get a clean energy standard through Congress? I mean, I think a clean energy standard, not billed as a climate law, purely a clean energy standard, would accomplish a great deal. And the question is there some scenario under which it can be stripped of its partisanship and we could get people around it? Because in principle, everybody seems to like it.
So just for a minute, I won't be a moderator. I just want to be a participant for this one because, in fact, I do think there's a real possibility of doing that. There's numerous states that already have done that. So we sort of have a bottom-up analysis where states are finding it in their economic best interest, they're finding it in environmental best interest. It's working. right now, and now we are seeing states as a laboratory for environmental improvement, and I really do think there could be a bipartisan way. A lot of people actually thought that in Waxman Mark's time, that there was in fact, that could have been done at that stage.
I don't know whether I agree. I think it's too hazy.
Which part? Whether it would work or whether people like
whether we could see a CES in the next two Congresses. I don't see the pathway myself right now. But I think John points out something terribly important that people got to recognize within the Republican Party anyways. Our state governors are the incubators for most of our policy. We're much more regimented, I'd say, that way than the Democratic Party is. So if you're interested in where Republicans are going for policy, you should spend some time looking at what the RGA is doing and what individual Republican governors are doing, because they have, obviously, based on the fact that we tend to bring our presidential candidates tend to come from the governor's ranks, not from the House or Senate. There's a great deal of influence that our Republican governors have over policy that you see at the federal level. I just haven't spent enough time to look at what each of the RGA members are doing as it relates to a CES in each of the individual states to make a kind of a good, quick analysis on whether they could try to drive something up on the hill. I just don't know.
By the way, I'm going to stop right now the questions, because our questions, I have more. By the way, you can do coal, you can do nuclear. There's all kinds of things that they're not going to agree on. But I want to hear from you. I would like to have questions from you all. And my only request is make it a question. And then we'll direct it and then give other people a chance to talk. Please, go ahead.
Yeah,
And if you would identify yourself so we know who you are.
I'm General Counsel and Director of Business Development for a Sharp Solar Company. And given the likelihood that comprehensive climate change legislation will not be passed over the next 4 years, it seems like regulations are one of the primary ways that government will be affecting energy and environmental policy. So my question is, and I don't think I really heard it, like, what are your thoughts on the environmental and energy administrative law apparatus under Obama versus under Trump?
So the question was, if we're not going to have legislation, what about the regulatory structure as it is advancing? Ray LUDWIZZEWSKI, I'm going to give this to you, so let me add the other sentence, and that is, and does it make a difference as to which of the parties were elected? So it's not legislation, but rather the regulatory process. Ray?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to think about it to give you a comprehensive, definitive answer, but my sort of off-the-cuff answer is that you probably would not see in a Republican administration a lot of interest in having a regulatory regime that would drive investment into winners and losers in the energy area, that we would probably let the market make those choices. So insofar as an industry needs government intervention to survive, it will probably prosper more under a Democratic administration than a Republican administration generally.
Ken, you agree or not?
Well, I think that I certainly agree that there'd be less regulation under a Republican administration. I do think that the Clean Air Act, the Supreme Court has held, clearly allows regulation of CO2 under the Act. We are seeing some regulations coming out. We've had regulations, we've had endangerment findings, we've had regulations requiring disclosure. We now have regulation governing emissions from new power plants. Pursuing climate change through a regulatory process is an option. I think you'll see, because the EPA will have no choice, lots of regulations coming out relating to that. Whether that's the ideal way to do it is a completely different question. But I think you will see regulations coming out on that. I don't think any of this really has to do with, personally, I don't understand the winner and loser argument, and it would be a great question if we have a chance to talk about that. I won't do it for this question, but I don't think this is a question of picking winners and losers. I think it's a question of really, in the case of regulation, and particularly just regulating the amount of emissions of CO2 you have from various sources.
Mark?
I would see that helping the natural gas industry before I'd see that actually helping the alternative energy sector. I don't know if you would agree with that or not, but I mean, coal's not dying because of what EPA is doing as much as coal is dying because of natural gas right now, and that's everybody should hopefully agree with that. I mean, there's some rhetoric out there that they disagree, but I mean, so from a regulatory perspective, excuse me, I would agree with Ray. There's not going to be a lot of desire to use the regulatory system in order to facilitate the growth of one industry over another. I think that a good point was made as it relates to winners and losers. And if you want to, we came out with a tax plan, and I mean, energy, unfortunately, energy gets sucked into tax reform. We propose getting rid of everything, every subsidy within the tax code. Not just energy, almost everything, and then buying down rates. That was basically Simpson Bowles on steroids. I find it perplexing to offer the idea that you're going to remove subsidies for one sector and not remove them for others. That's counter to kind of fundamental Republican principles of free market. And so I think that there's a problem with that assertion within the campaigns right now. So I disagree with that. If you're going to get rid of it, you got to get rid of it for everybody. That's just the way it is.
Mike?
I think the Republican platform and all their other statements make clear that if they take office, they'll shut down the EPA regulatory program. I think there's no question about that. They would say that greenhouse gases are not regulated under the Clean Air Act, and it would all stop. There's no question. I mean, Ray is quite right that we're dealing with an antiquated set of statutes which were designed for the problems of 20 and 30, 40 years ago. But it's what we have, and given what we have, it can accomplish a lot. The fuel economy standards, I think, are going to accomplish a lot. There's a lot that can be done with the control of conventional air pollutants that will have an effect on the fuel mix, in addition to the control on greenhouse gases. So I think it makes a big difference. We're going to use these imperfect tools rather than not using any tools at all. Let the market decide. It is a market that allows free use of the air and water for dumping untold quantities of pollution into the atmosphere. If you want to have a genuine market, you have to internalize the externalities. You have to have the costs of production reflect the cost that production imposes on everybody else. If you do that, I'm perfectly happy to see the winner emerge. But that is much different from the economy we have and much different from the economy that is proposed.
Ken, quick addition, then we'll take the next question. Ken, go ahead.
I think there's a strong argument there's an inherent market failure in developing new energy technologies, and that market failure is what really justifies the kind of subsidies we're talking about for wind and solar. If you think about it, when the Apple iPhone came out, according to Walt Isaacson's book, the iPhone cost twice as much as any other phone on the market. And yet Apple was able to sell millions of copies of that because the phone gave tremendous value to the consumers who were getting it. People loved it. They wanted to buy it, even though it was more expensive. That never happens in the energy area. In the energy generation area, what you're getting at the end is a bunch of electrons. It doesn't matter where it comes from. And so if you have a slightly more expensive product, you can't sell your product in that area. And in fact, there are regulatory commissions that won't even let utilities recover if they have more expensive products. So the result of that is that innovation is stifled if new technologies cost more to start with than they will as they develop, as they sell more units, as they get refined. And in fact, if you look at it, that's virtually always the case. It's very hard to think of an energy technology that was cost competitive on its first day. So you've got to come down this market curve of costs. We're seeing that. If you look at the cost curves on wind and solar, you're seeing that we're coming down that cost curve very rapidly. These are technologies that are well established. They're just getting cheaper. They work perfectly well. As I said, 35% of all new generation capacity in the United States in the last 4 years was wind. And so what these subsidies are doing is helping bring these new renewable technologies down the cost curve. It's the way we dealt with all energy technologies. We did that for the fossil fuel industry. There arguably comes a point in time when you don't need that subsidy anymore. Maybe the fossil fuel industries reach that point. I think the renewable energy industries will say there'll be a point in time we don't need these subsidies either, as soon as we get down to the right level. So I think there is a way to distinguish them. I think there is a need for these subsidies. It's nothing to do with the point that Mark made about ending all subsidies. That's a whole completely different discussion, which.
Well, I didn't. I didn't.
I'm gonna go to our next question, please.
My name is Isabel Silverman. I work for Environmental Defense Fund. We are a non-partisan environmental organization. And I have a question for Mark. So you said that the environmental groups have been politicizing this issue on climate change. And we're picking parties to work with, obviously referring to the Democratic Party, and that has been alienating Republicans, so they don't want to work with the environmental communities on solving environmental and health issues. So my question is,
It's all Fred's fault.
so my question is, so we have a problem, and I thought that politicians are elected to solve problems, pass legislation, to address these problems. So we have a problem that has to be solved. Pollution from the burning of fossil fuels and climate change. Right? And it has to be politicized. So why does this become a partisan issue when so clearly it should not be a partisan issue? Because we're all breathing the same air, we're all getting sick from dirty air and dirty water, we're all feeling the heat, suffering from droughts, etc. in terms of climate change. Why is the Republican Party thinking that this is a partisan issue? When so clearly
All right, I will repeat the question, then we'll give Mark, but we'll get other people, and that is, on the climate change issue, since it is in fact affecting all of us and it's scientific, why is that a partisan issue?
Well, like I said before, this didn't happen overnight. This was 20 years in the making, you know, politics is politics, in its simplest form. They care about getting reelected. So I'm going to look at, I'm looking at what are the issues that are going to get me elected in my district. I also tend to find myself, 9 times out of 10, if you look around the country at political races, federal races, and I'm not trying to lump EDF, right? I actually got a great deal of respect for EDF because they base everything they do on market-based approaches. So, love that. And science, which is what I'm sorry. But you know, I made it too much of a general statement, and not everybody's lumped in there. You know, NWF might not be lumped in there. They're a different organization, but just this is the premise. The premise I believe is true. Is that it just if you look around the country, you're going to see that the Democratic side will have the support of the politically active environmental community. And I know that EDF does some political work. They support both Republicans and Democrats. But I'm just 9 times out of 10. So if I'm a politician, I'm looking at it going, okay, well, they've picked a side. I'm not talking to their people because I get my, you know, I just have felt that we've gotten stuck in this rut where a lot of activity basically created environment to be mostly a Democratic issue, not a Republican one, and therefore Republicans are less inclined to think about it. And when they do think about it, I mean, they'll think about it in their districts. I mean, John Thune, obviously very conservative, big win guy because he's in South Dakota. So how we get out of that rut, I don't know.
Maybe you could help us.
Let me add just one corollary to this for Michael. Michael, you've talked about if you could ask a question of the presidential candidates, it would be, how do you handle science? Is this question a scientific question or a political question, this whole issue of climate change?
I'd like it to be a scientific question, because if you look at it as a scientific question, I think both the threshold answer presents itself quickly, and you are then compelled to do certain things if you are at all a responsible human being.
Well, earlier you said that, China isn't participating because they're pointing to us. Are they not responsible human beings?
No, what I said is that China needs to do everything it can to improve its energy efficiency and reduce the energy intensity of its economy. I think that is what can be expected of them, and I believe that they are doing a great deal in that direction, and they should do more, and we should encourage that, and we should help that.
But that's over. I mean, but you've got.
Art, you get last word, and then we're going to the next question. Go ahead.
As it relates to China, but you've got that overriding economic argument, right? That drives everything. I just, being out there in Iowa and New Hampshire, when you talk about China, people fear China purely from their economic might, and so. They are receptive to the premise that, why should we systematically stand down from an economic perspective? I mean, that's a position. If China's not going to do the same, because they are our immediately direct competitor on the global stage economically. I mean that's so you've got that overriding problem. That drives the whole argument on how to deal with climate change. I mean, that's.
Sir, your next question.
I'd like to ask a question about the same thing. Why is this considered not to be scientific? I don't understand it. I come from a farm background in Ohio. Certainly farms out there. I know what climate change has done to productivity, corn, soybeans, and wheat, bio, and it's affecting our economy terribly. And the denial of thing that it's not scientific, to me, seems to be so irrational.
So I'll repeat it. I'm giving it to Ray because I'm completely arbitrary and capricious. And that is, so Ray, why isn't this just simply a scientific question, end of analysis?
Well, I think that, as Mike would have phrased it, I think the threshold question, and that is, are we experiencing climate change? And if we are, is it humanly caused? Can be viewed correctly as a scientific question. Once you hit that tripwire, you then get into the policy issue of, well, what do I do about it? And I think where we start to then see differences is, I think the Republicans typically react that this is a global problem, and no matter how powerful we think we are, we can't solve it ourselves, and so we have to enlist others in doing so. And there are others in the world community who may well view waiting such that we do act unilaterally to our own economic disadvantage as the best international economic gamesmanship for their economies. And so against that backdrop, you begin to see, fissures, political fissures develop. And then the one thing I will point out is, 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago now, a president was elected and he had vast majorities in the House and the Senate and the White House, and he didn't prioritize this legislation.
Can I just So the only thing that's unilateral about U.S. action is the U.S. is the only major developed country in the world that did not sign on to the Kyoto Protocol. Every other major developed country has. Having said that, I think that there should be scope for international cooperation that does involve China. I'm thinking of the aviation and maritime sectors, and I think there are a number of other instances where a sectoral approach, cement, steel, other things, where there may be room for constructive international negotiations, and if we approach it on a sector-by-sector basis, it may actually achieve some progress and lead to some very good emissions reductions. I think we can also see cooperation on carbon capture and sequestration research. There are a number of other areas where there really is room for constructive dialogue and action, and I'd like to see more of that.
But I have a follow-up, the question, because I directed it at Ray. Ray said it really is a scientific issue. It really is a scientific question about whether or not climate is raising and whether or not human causes. He says there is, and I think rightfully says. Then there's a policy issue after that. Why is this even remotely complicated? Why do we simply not tax carbon that goes across the United States in a responsible way? And obviously that would have a market effect, like Mark was asking us to consider, that people then would simply take into account in how they price goods. Why would that not be a simple solution to a complicated problem?
I'll sign up.
Well, but again, it's an international problem. You then tax domestic, U.S. energy usage, and the benefit that you create gets swamped by India or China or someone else, growing and being energy inefficient.
Look, I think Ray is raising a legitimate question, and Mark to some extent, which is, does addressing this issue make us non-competitive? Raising that question, though, I don't necessarily reach the same answer they do, because I do think that the answer is very often no, and there are ways to deal with that relating to imports and things like that if you need to make that an issue. So just asking that question doesn't mean you don't do climate regulation. I think you've got to look at it. I think we can do all this, as I've been saying, in a way that makes economic sense and that keeps us competitive. And that's what we have to figure out. What we should be figuring out in Democrats and Republicans is how do we do this and still remain economically competitive? That's what we should be doing.
Well, Barb.
Thank you. Peter Funkenpfeiffer, and I have a question. And my question is, why doesn't it matter? There's the electron. Bring my question. Doesn't background, or at least the underpinning statement, assume that the price of electricity generated by fossil fuel, the then current price of electricity, could be the determinant as to whether renewables and others are in fact possible? And to frame the question a little further, if I'm getting electrons for my rooftop solar, that's giving me a 20-year hedge. That's giving me maximum power at the time that it's the greatest, and a number of other benefits. Should these attributes, and they are not externalities, I mean, these are demonstrable economic benefits, including the ability to provide power in locations where electrons cannot be produced. And underlying reasons, I think, that basing the discussion of economics on the then going price of fossil fuel prejudices the whole discussion and informs the whole debate against renewables and in favor of fossil fuels.
So the question, at least as I understand it, is notwithstanding the thoughtful statement by Ken that one electron is the same as another, doesn't the source of alternative energy really does matter?
Well, look, I think you're making very good points. There are very good arguments that would back up everything you're saying on that. But the fact of the matter is, in 99% of the cases in the country, the price of electricity matters very, very much. I mean, we all go on the assumption now in Washington that whatever we do in this field, we can't raise the price of electricity. We have to figure out how to lower the cost of clean energy, not how to get people to accept a higher cost of electricity. So again, whether that should be the case, whether you can argue there are other benefits and long-term benefits, sure you can argue that. But that argument hasn't really carried the day in most places yet. So that's the reason I made the statement, not because it's necessarily the ideal or the right answer. I'm just talking about the current realities of it. I mean, there was a wind project, for example, in Virginia a year or two ago that raised the, promoted by the utility, that raised the cost of electricity in their area by, I think, 0.2 of 1 cent, and it was turned down by the Public Utility Commission. So you do have that issue to deal with. Now, when you get to distributed solar and people have to start making their own decisions, then you've got a whole different ballgame in what you want to do on that. But again, we all think, you know, the work I'm doing on green banks and things like that, we're trying to figure out how to get the cost of solar low enough so that when people compare it to the cost of alternatives, they come out in a way that makes sense to them economically. And most people don't look at the 20-year time span. I wish they did, but not most people don't.
I'm going to keep going. Questions? Right here, please.
My name's Terrence McNamara. I know chemistry and graduate political science background, not nailed by. How much of this, and I'm going directly at a comment that Mark made earlier, I would posit that Republicans' view towards science actually is a spin-off of the fact of the realignment that starts with the 1960s Civil Rights Act. Republicans going conservative, Democrats going liberal, Southern Democrats leaving the party, becoming the Republicans, etc. Set that aside. That's not really important to the question. The question becomes, do any of you have any thoughts on what happens, as crudely put as it is, baby boomers die off, and Gen X and Gen Y become the policy drivers of the country? And what position will the nation be in economically if we have to wait those 15 to 20 years before that finally completes its cycle?
So I'll give you this question, Mark, since your name was raised first in it. And I think the question is really what happens if we, do we have to wait for the saviors of the next generation to come in and straighten this mess up?
I hope not. I'm trying to understand your question a little bit. I mean, are you talking purely economics? Are we talking about the
question comes down to, if you could remove the baby boomers from the voting pool right now, what would we get policy-wise in DC?
We
And
wouldn't,
if
we
we
wouldn't
could
have a
some
democracy
kind of solution,
anymore.
What happens to the country by having to wait for that?
We are doing what, in DC, we are doing what people elect us to do, what we elect our officials to do. If we are not doing global climate change legislation, it's because we don't have enough elected officials who support that. We don't have a president who prioritizes that. If you want to change that, don't defranchise older people or wait for the youngsters to grow older. Change the political economics, change the dynamic.
But Mark, I got to give you a chance. You want to add? Yeah, you know, are you there? By the way, it's
Well, if we-
millenniums that we're concerned about. Gen X, Gen Y, they're getting too old already. Millenniums is who will be the real saviors of all of us.
If we killed off all the old folk, I would propose that we probably would get a solution on Social Security. I'm actually serious. You know, I think that the younger generations are recognizing the state of an economy that they're going to be handed. You know, it's a diverse group. I find them socially moderate, becoming more fiscally conservative. In the fact that they recognize that some of the social safety net is not something that can be expected long term. So what I would say is, if it was Gen X making some decisions right now, they would probably make some pretty hard decisions on some of our entitlement programs that really need to be addressed to try to get the country back from the economic abyss that it's at right now. But this is way beyond energy and environment.
Next question, please. Go ahead.
You said that the issues have become political, but does it go
You know, I think yes, there are some out there that do kind of believe in that philosophy, but I think but I don't think that's not a majority. I think I think it's a minority within my party. Anybody I talk to, I mean, there's a recognition of the problem, but and how we get to solving it is extremely different between both parties. So, you know, I rarely run into a Republican that says that, you know, that the science is complete nonsense and climate change doesn't exist, and but we don't talk about it out loud all that much because, again, we've got our own political constituencies to deal with, and they view it as a partisan issue, and that's the problem.
And what's the chicken and what's the egg? Isn't a major reason why we have this large public opinion on the right is that the leaders are telling them that climate change is nonsense? Isn't that where it's coming from?
Exactly. On Fox TV, that half of Americans are watching.
That's Fox TV. That's not. I'm not.
Well,
That's fine, but I'm not. You're talking about the media, and I'm talking about politics. I mean, I'm talking. You know, that they're the message folks on the tube. You're asking me about political realities and political calculations made by Republicans, both at the presidential level and at the federal level.
I'm taking the question right there in the back, please.
I have a question about what is the Republican plan for addressing climate change? You know, I've heard a lot about what we shouldn't do, but I haven't heard anything about what should. And the reason I ask that is I can respect different approaches to solving a problem. I can't respect no. So I'd like to know what is, you know, what is the approach? I don't know what it is.
I don't know if anybody has the best answer. Mike actually read part of the Romney campaign information there. Ray, do you have anything to add?
yeah, but I don't know if there is a consensus Republican approach to solving climate change. I think it's safe to say that the approach that could get Republican support would be one that was global to address a global problem, and probably from a policy perspective, where we most, you know, deeply disagree with the way that Mike GERRARD articulated it, is that we don't think that the U.S. should go out and unilaterally disadvantage itself economically, and we would work in international organizations to get everyone to share the solution to the global problem.
Can I give you just one example? I mean, it just seems as if, you know, Republicans are not recognition. They don't recognize, you know, policy issues. Let me give you one example. There's a small provision that came out of the stimulus bill, which I didn't like, but it was 45Q. It's a tax provision that promoted the use of CO2 as a means of injecting old existing oil wells. There's about 60 billion barrels of oil in old wells that have been capped as a means of repressurizing the wells themselves to get the oil out. Without getting into details of the problems with the tax provision, because it doesn't work, it needs to be fixed. When talking to Republicans about suggesting that I've got CO2 emitters in the West that will sell their CO2 to oil producers in the West, so that they can then re-inject CO2 into the wells and pull out the existing the remaining oil that's in those wells. And I point out that in the end, we're actually creating a small trading system on CO2. It's market based. They get and they like it. So you come out with large pieces of legislation that just are big white whales that have untold problems. But if you strategically think about the type of programs and policies that Republicans can get behind, that one being a good example, you will find that they're receptive to it.
I'm going to look for questions on the right-hand side. Please, let's.
One of the things I wanted to ask is that certainly George W. Bush was not a flaming environmentalist. However, his administration did pay attention to a couple of issues that he seemed to be concerned about. One was wetlands, where the administration took pretty aggressive positions to wetlands. Another was oceans. We created Ocean Reserve. I've looked at the website for the Romney campaign. You know, I've listened to the debates. I haven't really read a lot of other material, but I'm just wondering, is there anything in the background of either Mr. Ryan or Mr. Romney from their pre-existing government experience that would indicate they have any interest whatsoever in any issue concerning the environment? I don't think that's an unfair question.
Yeah, I mean, again, I haven't done a comprehensive study of the Romney platform on this issue. I mean, he was governor of a fairly liberal state for a fairly long time, and yet Massachusetts has not fallen into the sea. So I don't think, you know, there's a basis for a great deal of worry on, you know, whether he's going to be problematic on.
He gets credit for that?
On these issues.
It was a low seat.
But you know, I think I will take the moment to point out that I read out the reauthorization, the list of the reauthorization the last time the major environmental statutes were reauthorized, and for those of us in the room who remember, every one of those was signed by a Republican president. And you know, Mike is quick to point out that we haven't signed the Kyoto Protocol was 20 years ago, and 12 of those years Democrats have been in the White House, and yet somehow they haven't got it signed. And that includes a president who had a substantial majority in both the House and the Senate when he took over 4 years ago, and he didn't prioritize it to have it signed. So if you actually look at the record, it's much less certain than the way it can sometimes be painted.
Other questions on this side of there, because I'm going to move over. Please, not far.
So from where I sit,
Please identify yourself.
David Lyons. Where I sit, Governor Romney has a very diverse policy path. As you say, he was the governor of the whole state. He was a fairly moderate governor there. He ran a pretty conservative campaign for a conservative party. What's he likely to be as president? Is it possible that we would have a kind of moment on energy policy, climate policy, Romney as president? They know. Will he be captured by his party in Congress, or will he demonstrate some independence and perhaps?
So I'm going to take your question, and I'm going to give it actually to Ken, and I'm going to rephrase it, and that is because I'm going to make it more bipartisan. Is there any relationship between what candidates say when they're running for office and then how they govern?
I hope so. I hope so, otherwise we're really not a very well-functioning democracy. But, you know, I think the problem that, that we would have in this area to some degree if Mitt Romney became president is that he's taking serious positions that make it very, very difficult for him to really come out ultimately on a side of encouraging energy, clean energy development. And the problem is that with the tax cuts he's talking about in this field, and I think that's a very, very high priority, those tax cuts are going to suck all the money out of the system. Right now, if you want to put back the production tax credit for wind into the system, it's probably going to be scored the way they figure out how much it cost at about $3 billion. With the kind of tax cuts that he's talking about, and assuming he gets them through, which was certainly his goal right now, I don't see how you find the money to do these kinds of programs. So even if we don't know whether really he's really pro-PTC, I mean, he said he's anti-PTC. Even if we somehow or other assume that maybe he's really not anti-PTC, even though he is anti-PTC, I still don't see how he finds the resources to do what needs to be done in this area, which I think is, for example, is extend these credits. In the wind area, as I said, 35% of all new electric generation in the past 4 years has been wind. As far as I know, since January 1st, when the production tax credit effectively ended, there have been no orders at all for wind turbines in the United States for completely new projects. A lot of backlog still, but there's nothing for a project proposed after January 1st. Now, when it all works out, if it doesn't pass, you will get some wind, but the expectation is you'll get a reduction of at least 75%. See, we need some of these incentives in place. I don't see where in the Romney platform you get the flexibility to do the kind of things that need to be done there. And of course, I think in a campaign, you've got to take him at his word when he says he's not going to support these, he's not going to support them. You know, and I think during a campaign, you've got to assume that.
Any other quick comment by the panel, then I'm going to go for other questions. All right, please, in the middle section here in the far back, yellow tie. So say it again, your question is, what group had an effect on?
Sorry, what contribution both parties have on
Okay. Okay, Michael?
I think if they're willing to, they can have a tremendous effect. Certainly the great presidents we've seen have all been drivers of public opinion. They do not simply read the polls. They realize, you know, what needs to be done, and they try to fix it. They try to make that happen. Franklin Roosevelt spent years trying to get U.S. public opinion behind becoming involved in Europe and many, many other things. It really is disheartening to hear the suggestion that all that matters is how today's voters will react to this, regardless of what the merits are. But it seems to me the essence of leadership is you lead, you try to drive where public opinion is to get to the right result. That if we merely follow the current public opinion, which is formed, and I disagree with poo-pooing Fox News. I think that those kinds of media outlets have a tremendous impact. I think if we merely follow that, then we really are sunk.
Others, I'm going to take others who have not asked a question, please.
I would agree.
So I'm being asked again, and I will, to restate the question so that we have it for history. And the real question is, I believe that although clearly in the past Republican presidents have signed legislation, has the party turned to the right for other reasons so that that's not possible any longer?
Yeah, and I would say I would disagree. I would invite you to go back to the first year of Bush 41 and Bill Riley as the EPA administrator, and the initiation of the Clean Air Act, the Pollution Prosecution Act, raising the penalties for violations of environmental laws for the first time since most of the laws were passed at that time in the 70s, the Two Forks Dam decision, the Al Aaron Apples decision, and of course Exxon Valdez, and then go to the websites of NRDC, Sierra Club, and see what grades Bill got. A lifelong environmentalist. See the C's and the D's. And then go forward 4 years. Can anybody here tell me what Carol Browner did in her first year in office? The silence is deafening. And then go look on the websites and see the A's and the B's. George Bush ran to be the environment president. He put Bill Riley in place. The organized environmental community did not welcome that, even though we passed the Clean Air Act. After a while, political operatives realize whether or not they're going to get support.
And I would say that today George H.W. Bush could not possibly win a Republican primary. I think that he was a moderate, a responsible fellow who did sign the Clean Air Act of 1990 and the Oil Pollution Act, and Bill Riley was terrific, and his party has moved far, far to the right. So I think that that question was right on.
Well, where was the support from the environmental community for those actions?
It is in the nature of the advocates to always say, go further in that direction. And so Riley
Bill
did
Clinton's Arkansas DEP was ranked 48th of the 50.
But Ray, I want to do a corollary to that question, because you properly brought up the fact when you started in your prepared remarks that we really haven't had any major legislation since 1990 in the Clean Air Act amendments, which I agree. Some of you know that an Environmental Law Institute, under a program that Leslie Carruthers started, is doing oral histories of the leading people from 1965 to 1975. I personally did about a month ago, John Dingell. I asked him, you know, what presidents stand out in your mind? And after he got done saying Richard Nixon, then he kind of backed off from that. He said George Herbert Walker Bush. Because of the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, and the Environmental Protection Agency was not passive. Riley was not passive. They were very active. My question is, can we regain that? Can we regain that time where we have had in the past? We had it when you were EPA General Counsel, where we, in fact, all of the people were working collectively together for a common goal. Can we do that?
I think it will be very difficult. I believe that around 1990, the organized environmental community in the United States had a choice. They could remain non-aligned, and like non-aligned nations in the Cold War, they would have had two competing groups interested in getting their support. They didn't do that, and now they're in an odd position where the Republicans don't feel that they have anything to gain, and the Democrats don't feel they have anything to lose. And so none of our issues move forward.
I have about time for one last question. I think I'll take it there in the far back, sir. So I'll restate your question. I'm going to give it to probably the leading academician in the United States on this issue, on climate change. Mike GERRARD, your professor out of Columbia, is probably the leading academician. And I'm going to give him the question. The question really is, we've been talking about climate change as if it's only a federal level. In fact, California, under Governor Schwarzenegger, Republican, actually passed AB 32. They're moving forward. Is that going to give us information? Is that something that we can build on in the future? Michael?
Well, I think AB 32 is probably the most, and other things that are happening in California are probably the most progressive actions on climate change anywhere in the world. And I think it's going to be extremely important to see how that plays out. I think one reason I'm not optimistic, unfortunately, about state-level action by the Republican governors is to the extent that Republican governors have national ambitions within their party, they realize that it would be suicidal to try to embrace any kind of climate regulation. I think we will see a lot of leadership from the cities, and cities like New York and others that are on the ground, literally in terms of having to cope with climate change, are going to be among the leaders in trying to behave rationally and prepare for adaptation to climate change, and we'll be setting lots of examples. And when they're the people who actually have to run the sewers and the trains, and when they show that this is what they need, it may be that it's the mayors who will give us a lot of the leadership that will then percolate up to Congress, and if anybody's listening, I think those will be very important voices.
Can AB 32?
Yeah, again, I don't know that we'll see an AB 32 type statute in other states, but I do think we will see various kinds of clean energy initiatives come out of states, including coming out of red states. I mean, I think when we look at this, one thing we should all realize from this discussion is we have to rebuild support in this, really from the bottom up, and rebuild support in the Democratic and rebuild bipartisan support. States are one place to start doing that. I actually have a paper being published tomorrow by Brookings Institution on state green banks, so we're working at a state level there. I do think we can make progress. Clean energy standards, which we spoke about, for example, 30 states have clean energy standards, including states like Texas and North Dakota. Plenty of red states have them. So there is room for progress at the state level. I don't think it'll be climate change legislation, but there will be progress on the steps you need to transition to a clean energy economy. And I think we should all push for that and try and get agreement there and eventually have it work its way up.
Ray and then Mark, then that's our last, states and their role.
Yeah, I think the states, Republicans have historically viewed them as the laboratories, and I think we'll continue to do that. I think it would be a great idea for states to continue to be leaders so that we can test out ideas. With regard to AB 32, historically, other states haven't adopted California's more avant-garde environmental, and so I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Mark?
I
Last thoughts.
Well, I can't add to what Ray said, but I think one policy area that we really didn't talk about all that much, except Mike did discuss it, is energy efficiency. And I do find that particular policy area within energy to be less fraught with political danger. And so, because you can make all sorts of economic arguments from a corporate perspective on why it makes sense for them to do what they need to do, because it saves them money, and they can push that money back in. So, with Republicans and energy efficiency, I think it's an area that's dull, boring, and very few people like to talk about it. But as Mike has pointed out, it has a potential for a major impact from a CO2 emissions perspective, and that is an area that that Republicans are comfortable talking about.
Let me remind you how we started. These are issues that are timely and important. The Environmental Law Institute thinks that these are things that should be talked about. We would have presidential candidates talk about and have positions. But if we don't get that, we want you to talk about it. We want you to think about it. We want you to debate it with us. These are exactly the kind of dialogue by principled people here and principled people in the audience that the public deserves, you deserve, and we think these are exactly the kind of things that make democracy rich and wonderful and gives us hope for the future. So I want everyone here to join thanking our panel for leading this discussion, for having the kind of adult debate that we hope will inspire our presidential candidates. Please, for all of us. And if you're not a member of Environmental Law Institute, you should be. Thank you.